Hey, I'm Scottie and I'm going to show you how to add depth and life to your watercolor washes in 3 easy steps. Adding a wash to your sketches is a little bit like adding sugar on the top of a cake or a thin spread of frosting, just for that final touch. But too much, overdo it, and you'll definitely have some regrets. So I'm going to be focusing on here the 3-step process that I take to add watercolor wash to my style of sketches. If you need a bit more in-depth background to this, I recommend you join my Patreon because I'm putting the full tutorial there. So I'll go through in depth all the materials, all the techniques, and my favorite color combinations for different subjects, and also go through some of my old sketches and show you examples of these techniques. Okay, so within this first step, there are 3 techniques that I want to show you. So we're adding a very light color wash. So we're starting off with a flat wash. Wet on dry. So that means we're leaving this paper dry. Let's get ultramarine. So what I'm going to do is I've put a bit of water in the pan. I've got quite a thick consistency of colour there. And I'll grab a few more. It's about 3 or 4 big brushfuls of water. Scrape on the edge and I'll get a bit more paint. And the reason why I need so much colour is because we've got quite a large square here. With wet on dry, it means the paper's dry and I get a nice bit of paint there, and you start at the top. So I go horizontally and we're just going to drag that paint down as we go. Okay, like that. Get a bit more. Just drag that down as we go. Okay. So the idea with a flat wash is that the saturation or the tone of the whole wash is pretty much the same throughout the whole way through. You can see here it's not too dark either. It's a very light wash. You can see a bit of the paper through it, and that's an excellent start for later when you're layering on the shadows and the details. If it pulls on the bottom, you can pick it up there and put it back on your paper towel like that. So I'll just do another example here. This is Viridian green. Now I swirl it around, I can see that's quite thin consistency. Okay, so now this is my object and I'm thinking in this first layer about the light. If the light's coming down from this way, I'll leave just a little bit more with this line, a little bit of white. So I might leave a little bit of white like that. And as I come down, I'll brush and pull that paint down to the other corner. Okay, but I want to keep it quite consistent. So this is a flat wash. I might take that right to the edge because the light's on the top there. And so we have a nice consistent color there. So I would use these kind of flat washes for small objects in your scene, like clothing. Because it's such a small object, you don't need to make that area too dynamic. You're just putting out the block color. And we can use the shadows and highlights to add interest later for those sort of shapes. Okay, so the next technique within this first step is a graded wash. This is wet on dry. And to make it a bit easier, I would just prop up your paper or your sketchbook just slightly there so that you've got a tilt on the page. So a graded wash is about the tonal value being light to dark. So if I get a little bit of permanent rose, just a little bit there, and add a whole heap of fresh water. And so we start at the top, and then as we go from left to right, we get that bead that forms at the bottom, and we drag it down. And as we go, we can add a bit more saturation. So a little bit more paint in there. Keep dragging that across, and probably need a lot more now, just to exaggerate and show you what the graded look is. Goes down, and the paint will go down the page there. Can pick out some of this. So start super light at the top, and as you pull it down, it'll slowly increase in value to the bottom, and we have a nice gradient. And that brings a little bit of depth to your watercolor washes, this first step. I also want to show you what it would be like with skin tone. So my favorite color for skin tone is burnt sienna. So what we're going to do is just a little bit in the palette, like that. Just getting a bit of water there. Okay, we start at the top here. So once again, if the light's coming this way, we'll just leave a little bit of a white gap there, just to show the light glinting off the side of the face. We've got this. And we add some more saturation to it. As it comes down, we go into that bead. We come down to the other side of the face, which would be closer to the line on that side. Okay, get some of that paint out. You can leave a little bit there so it goes saturated, but it won't cauliflower. Okay, so that's a graded wash. These are for larger surfaces. So this is the smaller areas, and this is the larger areas. Okay, the next technique we're going to work on in this first step is a variegated wash. and we're going to be looking at wet on wet. I use this mostly for skies, so you can see here in this sketch of the lighthouse where I've done the sky behind, it's got a very nice soft edge to it, so we don't have the hard edges here. So we'll get a bit of water and we'll wet this area here. Just wet that slightly, and we'll try this on this circle down here too. Okay, so in this exercise, let's choose cadmium yellow and put a bit of cadmium yellow at the top there. Okay, and then it's going to go down to a cadmium red. So we're hoping for a very subtle and soft transition between colors. Okay, so we'll start at the top here, and we can leave a little bit of a gap, and you can see already how soft that blend is. And as I come down, if I add a bit of that red into the yellow, dip here so I don't have too much, and then I'm going to add it just here in the middle, and then in the bottom half, the bottom third, I'm going to add the pure color like that. I'm going to mix those a little bit, try and get that gradient, a really nice soft gradient. That's the variegated wash. We can try down here, it's dried a bit down there. Grab my round 8, a little bit of yellow, start at the top again. This is dried a bit, so we'll see how soft it is. Sometimes it's nice when it's not totally wet, it's just a bit damp. I'm going to come in, add some red to here, and it's getting a bit more cadmium red down there to the bottom, and we'll try and get close to that circle edge. So that's the first step. We're adding the areas of color in a wash, and we've got 3 techniques that we can use it. For smaller areas, I use the flat wash. For a larger area, I use these 2, graded wash and variegated wash. So we have just the tone, and that can be aiming towards the lighter side. And then we have different colors for skies. These add a bit more interest to larger areas. So we finished the first step, which is a light color wash, and we've got to let that layer dry. So you can either wait a few minutes, or you can use a hairdryer just to lightly dry it, and that'll speed up the process. So in this second layer, we're doing shadows. So we need to know where the light's coming from. So in these examples, in these circles, the light's coming from the top left. So that means we're going to be adding a layer of shadow on the bottom right here. So the fancy name of adding a second layer on top is called glazing. We've got a dry first coat, and then we're adding another light layer. This layer is still going to be quite transparent. So let's get ultramarine, and we mix quite a lot in this section here. So with an object, say we're doing a jacket that's green, we just want to add just a tiny bit of rose to that. See, it mixes in quite strongly. So we have a dark purple. The light's coming from this way, so it's got an opposite curve to the top here. Brushing that out there. And you can even add a shadow here, so we'll just put a little shadow, might be a bit too strong, just a little shadow where the light comes down onto the table. Now for skin tone, this purple would stand out too much. So I like shadows that are a little bit lighter and warmer. So to make that easy for myself, I've got this color called Purple Lake. Now you can make this purple with adding a bit more permanent rose. Much better to go too light than too dark. And see there, yes, that's right. So now here, once again, adding the shadows. One little layer, layer. Now to me that looks quite light, but when you're doing skin tone, you really don't want it to be strong and stand out. And I can add a little bit of a shadow here too. There. And we've got our final object here. And you can see the variegated wash is dried quite nicely. It actually gives a bit of depth around that sphere because of that color change. So I use that quite a lot with sketches to give an interest and a shape to the form. Probably an example of doing a bit darker. So I can take that, if it's too dark, take it out. Dry brush, once again, a bit of a shadow there. And within those shadows, if you feel like the purple color is a bit too strong, then add a bit of ultramarine back, and you can put it into that shadow there, and that'll give it a bit more dimension. So add a bit of dimension into this shadow, a little bit more ultramarine in there. So that's that second layer of shadows, and you can see that the depth is starting to appear, especially on these two where you've got the gradient, the graded wash. We have a really nice light shadow there, and if that was skin tone, it would look quite nice. And then here, this shadow here is very dark, so you don't have to make it that dark, but the color and the shadow help give it that form. And then here, the flat wash one, that's probably the least three-dimensional. So step number 3 is to add details. Adding details is really important because it brings a sketch to life. We add the brightest points, the highlights, and the darkest points, little dark saturated points and splatters to add texture and depth. It's also the point where you can really overdo it. So I tend to add a lot of splatters and highlights, and sometimes at the end I think, oh, I added too much. Be careful in this stage, and this is where you know if you've done those 2 first layers light enough, because those highlights and those dark spots really stand out. So let's first add some highlights, and I've got a Posca pen, which is an acrylic marker, fine tip, the best pen I've found to add onto washes. So if I'm thinking about the light coming this way, if the watercolor was up to the edge, I'd probably add a bit of a white highlight on the edge there. So that's already done with my watercolor, but somewhere in here might be reflecting the light. So let's put a little highlight there. See, and in the skin tone, you might have a few dots as well, and over here. So we could add a little bit more of a streak there like that. So there's a few different ways you can do it. You can have more of a bigger blob like this. You could have some small dots, make that a bit thicker. And the reason I wanted to make this a little bit bigger than the others is because it doesn't have that graded wash underneath, whereas this one has a nice graded wash, so you can see that quite easily. And I'm imagining that this is a shiny surface, so we'll add that there. Also, what I look for is to define shapes. So if this was on a flat background and had a flat shape there, we want it to stand out. So what I do sometimes is give a little outline to the shape. So you can do that, or little highlights here in the dark areas where it reflects. So I often look around my sketch, not only in the highlights where the light is shining on the object directly, for example here on my face or on my nose, that's sort of those examples, but also on the dark side, where is there something reflecting from behind. So it's interesting to add something on the other side too, some little highlights like that. There might be some reflections in the table to make it interesting. This is quite a dark area here, and I don't want it to get lost. I want there to be a little bit of separation, so you can add some highlights in there too, and some lines like that. And the third place I put highlights is on the pinch points, or the edges on things, the sharp edges. So if there was a sharp edge along here, you might add some lines across that. So you might put a highlight in that line there. So often with wrinkles in clothing, see the wrinkles in clothing like this, I might put a little bit of a highlight on part of that wrinkle. Okay, so there's some highlights. See, it's very subtle, but it just brings it out a bit. It's really nice. Oh, and also if you've got a wash like this and you want to break it up a little bit more, you can add white coming from the outside of the shape. So if I was to come in like this, like that, and just make the shape more interesting. I do that a lot with water and also clothing. And the opposite side of adding the highlights in this details step is to add some dark spots, something to draw your eye in and give that depth. So for example, with the Viridian green, I might add a little bit of a different color, maybe a bit of turquoise to that Viridian green, and that's quite a thick paint there. There's not as much water as I usually do, and I might add just a little spots of that green like that around. So to give that depth, I've got the big highlights there and some little interesting points there. So I've burnt sienna, and I'll do that for the skin tone as well, just to make that interesting. You might just add a little bit of the darkest saturation. Okay, it's very subtle. And on the other side, we've got cadmium red and yellow, and that might go there too. Just an interesting little bit of saturation. Okay, so it depends what subject you're doing, but I like that kind of really dark spots. And then we go into splatters. Now, people ask me, why would you do splatters? It is a bit messy, but I think it gives that texture to this, sometimes this flat wash, and makes it really interesting. And it can also give movement and put in that texture that you wouldn't be able to do normally because it's so random. So if I've got this Viridian green with a little bit of turquoise, So I'll demonstrate the first technique for splatters is using the brush you actually have used to do most of the work. And so in this technique, we're tapping the brush. So one way you can tap the brush, I better take some of the paint off, is just like this. See? But the disadvantage with this, using this brush, is that it has quite a range. You can also put your finger like this and tap like that. See, not as much control, but if you take a bit more water out, the more water I have, the bigger the splatters. So if it's got lots of water out and you tap it quite hard, like this, you get a bit more accuracy. And what I'm looking for is a nice texture to blend towards the light and blend between the shadow and the light. So that's quite nice. You can also get the shadow color as well. Take a bit of the water out and do the same thing. I like to give the shadows a bit of a dynamic look as well. So that's using a brush to do the details there. You can even use a toothbrush to do this. So for the second one, we've got burnt sienna here, and then we soak it up with the toothbrush. Soak as much as you can up, and I think I'll need a bit more. But yeah, you can see if I come in close here how fine that mist is. And so this is great for having a really subtle gradient when you don't want too random splatters. And it's like an airbrush. So I use this on that car tutorial because I got a really nice gradient at the back. So that's a toothbrush. You can see that forming. And then another idea is to use a really old brush. So let's get cadmium red and cadmium yellow. So I have an orange. Whoops, probably put a bit too much water in there. So dab it on here, and you can also test on the paper towel. Now, because the shadow here was a bit darker than I expected, and it's covered up a lot of that orange, I want to put a darker orange to transition between the yellow and the shadows a bit more. And I've got a bit more direction here, so I'm aiming the flicks up towards the yellow. So instead of using a layer, I'm splattering it on. There's some nice splatters there. So the last two techniques of adding splatters was a lot more finer. So the toothbrush had the finest spray, and tapping the brush had the least amount of control, the biggest dot. And even in here, in these shadows, you can add a little bit more interest, and in this one too. So that's how I add depth and life to my ink sketches using really dynamic watercolor wash techniques. So let me know in the comments how you find adding watercolor washes. And remember, if you need more help on this, I've got the full tutorial where I explain all the in-depth detail behind this on my Patreon. I've also got some simple guides that you can download to help you as well. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.